Big tech is killing agentic AI with marketing that has become silly stupid. Let's talk about it. So welcome to Dave Linthicum is Not AI. I'm Dave, an AI SME and an AI skeptic, looking at AI with a balanced perspective. Let's get started. So at the week I'm recording this, actually Google Next is on in Vegas. Didn't get an invite, which is fine. But I've been watching it remotely. And one of the things I see coming out of that event is striking me as something that's extremely silly. And that is the overuse of Agentic for everything. And if you look at Google Next, they say things like the Agentic Enterprise and Agentic Data and the Agentic Cloud. They just put Agentic in front of every technology that they sell, and hopefully it's going to, be a modern market spin. And so in other words, people are going to start buying their technology magically because they're using the term Agentic. So we're seeing this kind of silliness in the tech world a lot, and it's getting worse. In other words, as any kind of a buzzword starts to emerge and the marketing teams thinks it's going to get to some traction, they start overusing it. And so much so that it's actually going to kill the term. So in other words, it's going to kill the technology. In other words, everybody's associating Agentic with something that has a particular value. And if that value doesn't show up, then suddenly Agentic is going to be dead and it's going to be considered failed technology when it really had nothing to do with that. So, and don't get me wrong, I am a fan of Agentic AI as an architecture pattern. I use it myself. I've been using, that technology for many, many years, in, more primitive form since the 80s. And it's perfectly fine. In fact, I have the most watched Agentic AI architecture course out there, and I'll go ahead and put it up there. Not bragging about that, but the thing is, I'm all in terms of the value of that particular kind of architectural pattern. What I'm not all in on is the overuse of the term Agentic to describe everything, and really with selfish and stupid intentions around it. I understand the marketing teams are there and they're behind this, and we have billions of dollars in marketing that are pushing this technology, and they're trying to figure out a way in which they can push themselves ahead of the crowd in terms of the AI spending, and they think Agentic is the best way to do that. However, labeling everything Agentic is just not going to work in your favor. And in fact, it's going to backfire. And my concern is that it's going to backfire so much, it's going to cause some confusion where Agentic will be, synonymous with failure because we're not going to be able to deliver on many of the promises that are being made. Agentic AI is a great architecture. It's a great set of enabling technology, but it has very narrow use cases, and it has very narrow ways in which it can return value back to the business. So it's important that we understand that. And I think labeling everything Agentic is just something that is making the companies look silly, and it's confusing the hell out of everybody. So much of what's being sold as Agentic AI is really a rebrand of existing orchestration, workflow automation, copilots, or rule-based systems with a thin layer of generative AI on top. So that may help vendors win headlines, but it does not automatically create measurable business value for the enterprises. We're way out over our skis on this. So in other words, I understand why the marketing team is doing it. I wish they would be a little bit more creative and think a little bit more than 30 seconds in creating these branding campaigns that they have. But at the end of the day, if everything's going to be Agentic, then nothing is Agentic. And if Agentic ultimately doesn't deliver the value, then Agentic is going to be linked with failure. And you drove it. So the danger is that enterprises will buy into the language before they see the outcomes, investing in Agentic platforms without clear ROI, governance models, or operating cost justification. So once leaders ask what these systems actually improve beyond demos and slideware, a lot of these claims will start to unravel. And that's already occurring. In other words, people are coming to me in many occasions, enterprises, the people who are going to be the end users of purchase, people who are going to purchase this technology, and ask me, what is this? Why should I use it? And, what are the vendors trying to sell me? Well, the reality is that there is value there. You just have to look and figure out how to present the value and how to find the value. But it's not systemically changing the way in which we use enterprise systems, and certainly systemically to changing the way we use AI. Ultimately, it's an architecture pattern that has relevancy in certain very narrow problem domains where business value can be found. But the majority of problem domains out there aren't going to need an agentic-based framework. And so you selling everything as agentic is just setting yourself up for failure. So we've seen this movie before with SOA, service-oriented architecture, where valid architectural concept got buried under hype, oversold promises, and vendor positioning. The same thing happened with microservices, which were pitched as the answer to everything, even when many companies lack the scale, discipline, or talent to use them well. So we seem to chase buzzwords, and it's getting worse. And so, back in the 90s, I wrote a book called Enterprise Application Integration, which created a space. Everybody rushed into the space, and suddenly everybody had EAI-enabled products. And so enterprise application integration was being attached to everything. And the problem with that, if it was everything, it couldn't be, just a narrow range of technology, which is the way in which I defined it in the book, that allows these systems to communicate one to another. So it was overly applied, and the buzzword was overly used. And obviously, it couldn't reach or meet those expectations in many instances. And so technologies that were branding themselves as enterprise application integration were found out pretty quick. And they failed. And suddenly, EAI got some bad connotations because of that failure. We're going to see the same kind of pattern here with agentic AI. Also, we saw this before with microservices, as I mentioned before. That was overused. People didn't understand how it was going to be applied. Very much like agentic AI, it had very narrow value that it could bring to very narrow sets of problem domains. And the same with cloud native, and the list goes on. So I understand this is a marketing thing. In other words, the marketing teams with these enterprise software companies have to glom onto something, and they have to really kind of figure out a way to set themselves apart. But I think chasing the buzzword is ultimately something that's going to backfire, because they're going to look silly in a few years, but suddenly, this agentic stuff, or everything's an agentic, buzzword blows up in their face. So big tech is not just making agentic AI popular, it's redefining it so loosely that customers cannot easily separate genuine autonomous reasoning from ordinary scripted behavior. That confusion hurts the market because real innovation gets lumped together with inflated claims, making buyers more skeptical of everything. So this is the you lie to me once, I'm never going to believe you again, kind of thing. And I think that many of the vendors, and many of them are large vendors who are doing this right now, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, to be the top three, are going to find their credibility goes away. In other words, if they're telling them something is going to be possible around a particular buzzword that's supposed to bring a tremendous amount of value, and that value never arrives, then they're not necessarily going to believe the claims you make in 2028 and 2030 and all the different evolutions of technology moving forward. Believe it or not, the technology industry is going to move away from agentic AI at some point, and people will look back on its value that it brought into the enterprises. And if the value is not easy to define, which I don't believe it's going to be, then that's going to be considered a failure. You guys are going to be really kind of considered as liars, and you're going to have some credibility issues moving forward. So if this continues, agentic AI may stop meaning a breakthrough category and start meaning the next industry shorthand for overhyped and underdelivered. I do see this, kind of as a label for, thinking more about something and overusing particular buzzword, because I've never seen it at this level right now. It's absolutely an immense bunch of silliness that's going on in the industry. And of course, the Google Next conference, which is going on this week, is another indication of that. The irony is that big tech may end up killing the credibility of agentic AI, not because the concept is useless. It's very useful, but because they market it too aggressively before providing the business benefit. So this is, at essence, what this is going to end up doing. So we're going to see a backlash around the overuse of this particular buzzword. Now, and many of the vendors who are doing it, they think that's not going to come back on them because everybody's doing it. So in other words, they're following or trying to become a fast follower in a marketplace. Everybody is talking about agentic. All the cloud providers, all the big enterprise tech providers, agentic. And by following it and trying to lead the market, they think they're going to get an advantage. And if there is some backlash from that, it's going to be backlash against the entire industry, not necessarily the companies that, or one of many, that are pushing the buzzword. I think that could be a little different now. I think ultimately enterprises are truly looking for technology companies that they can trust, who aren't necessarily spinning things away, overvaluing things like cloud computing and service-oriented architecture and microservices and cloud native, and certainly agentic AI or even generative AI. But the ability to figure out how they're going to be able to use this technology to solve problems that they have now. We're reaching an inflection point. In other words, AI is about to take off like a rocket because people are going to use it as a true force multiplier for the business. And they're going to get into solving issues with technology out there that's been marketed to them. And if that technology doesn't live up to the hype, they're going to remember that more so than anything else that occurred in the past. So you technology vendors would be wise to be careful. In other words, I understand where you're using the buzzwords and you're playing the buzzword bingo game just like every, enterprise, technology player plays, but also understand that there's going to be a backlash from that. And you don't want to be there to make the huge mistakes where you're going to be remembered for making those mistakes. And by the way, I'll remind them. So, a couple of years, I'm independent, influencer now. And I will bring that up, that you did this if you truly do it. So in other words, you made assumptions, you made assertions around the value of a particular idea, this case a buzzword, and you weren't able to deliver. Well, anyway, let me know what you think of the comments about this, whether you agree with me that agentic AI is way, way, way over its skis in the hype, or if you think it's just the way technology works. In other words, we're always going to chase whatever the next shiny object is, and we're certainly doing that with agentic AI now. So anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course, my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. Finally, check out my other YouTube channel, The Cloud Computing Insider. Link is in the description. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks this is another one of my videos that you should watch next. Take care, guys.